Hello, today we're going to be talking about the effectiveness of macroeconomic policies to manage the effects of supply-side shocks. As a 25-mark essay, really current because at the moment the UK has experienced supply-side shocks, so we're going to base this on the UK. But it's a hard question because you've really got to decide what you want to talk about in this essay and go with your plan. You can't speak generally, you've got to pick the supply side shock, you give the example, and then you've got to pick the policies to talk about. And the effectiveness of those policies, what does that mean? I think in the context of this, it's whether it has trade-offs with other macroeconomic objectives, particularly is bringing down inflation going to conflict with other things as well. So there's a lot of work to do to get to a decent answer to this question. First of all, I think that the key to this essay is how you start. You want to define your macroeconomic policies, and I think here I'm going to be talking about a contractionary monetary policy. We know that interest rates in the UK have been raised to 4.5%. We might put that actually in the beginning of our essay, and we know that expansionary supply side policies are needed in the context of weak trend growth and weak productivity, relative productivity in the UK. And finally, we want to know what the supply side shock is. So we're talking about possibly something to do with the situation in Ukraine, with Russia, energy, weak prices, for example, and the impact that that has had on the UK. Right, see what you can get with that, give it a plan and come back and see what I've done. Right, so here are the two diagrams that I've done, and the one on the left is perhaps a little bit more difficult, not probably what you would expected, but is the reality of what we are facing or what the UK is facing. So we want to show that there has been, first of all, you want to explain the supply side shock that has happened. So that is the SRAS 1 to SRAS 2, raising the price level from P1 to P2 and lowering growth at the same time. We see that there with the initial position, external shocks raising the costs of production, putting down profitability, possibly even there are firms which leave the market because they're no longer profitable. Supply falls, SRAS shifts left, and we're getting cost push inflation generating that, but also because growth is pulled down as well, we can see Y1 to Y2 is generating lower growth. That's showing then that we are entering a period of stagflation, stagnation, that means lower growth, and inflation at the same time. And that creates real challenges for policy making. So what do we do about it? Well, we could put in a contractionary monetary policy, and we know that that's happened in the UK, raising interest rates to 4.5%, increasing borrowing costs, which is going to pull down particularly durable consumption, things like houses and car spending, investment, anything that's funded by borrowing, and investment often is because it's such large projects, which is going to shift AD to the left, to AD2, to that green line. And the effect of that, you can see, is that you have pulled down P2 to P3, you've pulled down the inflation rate, but you at the same time you sacrifice growth, and growth has already fallen because of the external shock, and it will fall again. Now, it's important to note that this policy has not solved the problem of the original cause of the external shock. Wheat prices and energy prices have not been solved or pulled down by this particular action. All it has done is used demand side policies to solve a supply side issue or a supply side shock. And you could say then, therefore, that the government doesn't have the power to control international supply issues. It doesn't have the power to control, at least in the short term, world energy prices or world wheat prices, and therefore the next best thing that it can do is control its domestic economy. So here we're in the 4.5 section of the Edexcel syllabus, and the degree to which the government is in control of global issues, and really it's not. Our policy making can only really effectively target domestic issues, domestic spending, domestic supply issues. If we want to evaluate that, I mean, hopefully we've gone back to the question there and we said that actually therefore we can see that this is not particularly effective in managing the external shock. However, we want to argue against that. We want to say, well, there may be some things where the government can manage it. It does have monopsony power in health, education, transport. We know that, for example, recently the government has been holding down wage demands of nurses, of teachers, of railway workers, and therefore, if it has monopsony power, the power of a monopsony can reduce the wage rate of public sector workers, and that might therefore reduce the possibility of a wage price spiral. It might mean that the supply shock is less pronounced, and if you can deal with other supply issues in the UK and holding down public sector wages, maybe you can dampen the effects of this. You could go further. You probably can't do that in the long run. If you refer to my previous video on inflation, we went through the delayed effect of the fact that wage rises will increase, but there will be a time lag between them. You could talk about the degree of unionisation. We know that unions are less powerful in the UK than they used to be, and so therefore perhaps that monopsony power is or is not effective in the long run and short run. There's a debate to be had there. You may also say that larger countries also might actually be able to control to some extent external shocks. Many countries have significant political power. They can possibly work through external bilateral or multilateral agencies, like for example, I mean, OPEC, for example, if you're a member of that, you might have the ability to control world oil prices, for example. The US is able to mitigate external shocks. We saw the US supplying more LNG to Europe and negotiating further gas supplies to Europe. So it might be possible, and that there may be the energy price cap. It might have some limited effects there as well. So no, the UK government's general normal policies don't affect world prices and world issues, but some countries might actually have some power to do more than we may otherwise think. Second policy, expansionary supply side policy. You might want to go back to my previous video of the supply side issues facing the UK. This is where we can get a lot more application in and use in the current context of the UK economy. Pause the video, plan this, and come back. So we're talking about supply side policies in shifting LRES out to the right. That is going to pull down our price level and increase our real national output in the opposite effect of what we have over on the diagram on the left. So both of the effects here are positive. So you've got your initial position, you've got your new equilibrium there as normal. You just need to pick a policy. You could do anything you like really here. You could talk about investment in infrastructure. I've got HS2, for example, but you could really do anything. I've chosen infrastructure because that's quite a useful policy if you want to increase regional growth in the north, for example. It's nice and current. And you might comment on the mobility of labour. You might talk about a fall in the natural rate of unemployment. Maybe people are structurally unemployed because they're geographically immobile. And you might talk about the knock-on effects of investment from firms, and perhaps firms in Manchester invest more because they have more access to workers. The Manchester economy, it starts to grow faster, for example, and for all of those things, government spending is rising, investments rising, LRS is shifting to the right, and we're getting a new equilibrium where we have higher trend growth in the context of the UK's 1% trend growth that we saw in the previous videos. That's important. And the context of this is, well, the conclusion, I suppose, of this is that the government is able to manage the supply side shocks without impeding growth. They're bringing the price level down, and that is making the country more resilient to future external price shocks. So there are things that the government can do, but they take some time. In evaluation, well, we know that investment in the UK is already weak after the pandemic, after Brexit, after the lower spending of austerity, only 18% of GDP. So how effective are these policies going to be? The very nice point is that the short-term monetary policy of raising interest rates actually further dampens investment anyway. So the increase in LRAS anyway is going to be pulled down. The national debt is high, £116 billion worth of debt interest repayments. How much money is available for this, and is it sustainable if you are going to borrow it, particularly in the context of higher interest rates that are going to have to be paid in order to borrow this money? So you may say that these things are all perhaps not very likely to be implemented. And again, the real problem with it is the time lag, because an external shock is generally short-term and probably pretty temporary, and it needs to be addressed quickly before a wage price spiral takes place or starts to take hold. So supply-side policies can't be used as a reaction to an external shock. You would hope that the supply-side policy would have already been implemented in the previous years, and when the external shock takes place, the economy will be more resilient and more able to weather the storm, I suppose. So in judgment, in the current context of the UK economy, I think there are limited options given the low trend growth that are currently experiencing. Although low unemployment, 3.8%, there is possibly some room for contractionary policy. The output gap in the UK is near zero, and so actually if you're going into a deflationary gap or a negative output gap, it won't be that severe, possibly. In the long run, again, as I said before, we're making the economy more resilient, and the past, and I think that really is the real background to the question. The weak supply side policies in the past mean that the way in which the government can manage this set of supply side shocks is limited in effectiveness, at least in the short run. And in order to plan for future supply side shocks, the government should institute supply side policies now to make the UK supply chains more resilient, to enable, for example, to diversify the UK's energy supply, for example, to diversify or bring some production home, possibly, in order to focus on that resilience of supply. A tough question, but hopefully that gives you some ideas for how you could go about answering that. Thank you for watching.